Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar from the Institute of Export and International Trade, in which we are going to answer your questions about the move from Chief to CDS. My name is William Barnes-Graham, the Executive Editor at the Institute, and I will be your host for this afternoon. Next slide, please. Thank you. So here you can see that it's my delight again to welcome back Matt Vick, our CDS expert in residence. Hi, Matt, how are you?
Perfect. Thanks, Will. Yeah, probably starting to see the letters C, D, and S in my sleep at this point, but par for the course, I suppose.
Absolutely. Well, we'll be seeing a little bit more of it this afternoon. But Matt is a customs and trade specialist at the Institute with extensive international trade experience, stemming from his background in freight forwarding and customs services. And as Matt alludes to, he's currently delivering a lot of the Institute's CDS training and consultancy at the moment. So we're very lucky to have someone here who is very much in the highest of demand at the moment, as you can probably imagine. But on the next slide, we're going to run a poll to find out a little bit more about you, our audience. So we are here asking, how do you currently submit declarations to HMRC? The options there are that you may self-file, which would be submitting them yourselves. You may do it through an intermediary, that could be a customs agent or broker. You may do it through a mixture of self-filing or using intermediaries, or you may not actually submit declarations at all at this stage. Just while you are answering that poll, a couple of quick housekeeping notes from me. Firstly, you can contact me with any comments or questions using the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We hope to get to a number of your questions today, though please note that we have received hundreds of questions in advance of today's webinar, so we cannot guarantee we'll get to everything in the allocated time. If we don't get to your question, please do review the Institute's CDS support package for members, which includes access to our technical helpline. There's also a range of support which the Institute is providing, which we'll come on to shortly, and that includes training and consultancy. But I think I've given you all enough time to answer that poll, so I'll give you 3 more seconds. 3, 2, 1, and I'm going to share the results of that poll. So just over 2/3 of you use an intermediary, 68%. Only 14% of you self-file. 1/10 of you do a mixture of both, and just under 1/10 of you do not submit declarations at all. Matt, any surprises there? Is that about what you'd expect?
Yeah, roughly on the nose, I would say. I mentioned it before in one of the previous webinars, but we have seen a slight increase in the self-filing, I think, with the advent of CDS, with some traders using it as a chance to switch to that method. But it is interesting to see still that the vast majority are through an intermediary. I do wonder if some got closer to the CDS deadline and decided that they would prefer that method rather than deal with it themselves. But yeah, interesting as well. We've got many here that don't submit declarations at all, a fair proportion actually. In which case, I wonder if they're just here just to get more information, or perhaps they don't realize an agent does it for them. That can happen sometimes. But yeah, nothing too surprising there.
No, thanks, Matt, and thank you everyone for answering. We have a fair few questions about CDS and the using of an intermediary or an agent, so we'll come on to that in a bit more detail shortly. But to give a quick recap of the CDS migration, on the next slide, it is my delight to hand over to you, Matt. So over to you.
Yep, thanks very much, Will. Yep, so as we mentioned on this next section, we're just going to briefly cover some of the broader points of what the transition is going to entail, and just some of the key dates to bear in mind. There's one slightly new point in there that you might not be aware of, which we'll mention. But next slide, please. So as we all know, CDS fundamentally is going to be here to replace the by now quite venerable Chief system. It's approaching 30 years old, so it's in need of a bit of an update. Now, the first key date to bear in mind, and obviously the one that's very imminent, is the 30th of September 2022, at which point Chief is going to be phased out for use on import declarations. Now, there has been an extremely recent announcement, i.e. literally yesterday, the 20th of September, the guidance was published, HMRC is potentially going to allow some traders to apply for an extension for about a month on continuing to use Chief. This is only in scenarios where you can prove where you physically cannot make that switch for whatever reason. It's usually probably going to be technical limitations because there's a lot of people that have had issues around their government gateway, perhaps. What they won't really permit is people that don't want to move over because they're perhaps not comfortable with the processes internally or anything like that. In those scenarios, they'll probably point you to the online guidance or the support offered by someone like the IOE. So if you do get permission to get the month extension, part of that is a commitment from you to HMRC where you'll pretty much promise that, yeah, we'll switch as soon as we feasibly can within that month period. So this is not a catch-all extension, just to be clear. It's only really for those that have a genuine problem in getting ready for the changeover date. Now, for exports, Chief will be phased out on the 31st of March, 2023. So in the meantime, you can continue using Chief for your export declarations. Now, of course, we'll have probably a series of advice when we get to that point again later, but just to point out, if you register for CDS now for the import side, you won't need to do it again for March next year. One registration is all that's required. So all the sort of admin that you've gone through now, you won't have to repeat. Now, if you're perhaps one of those traders that is a bit unsure, a bit uncomfortable about the upcoming transition, then as mentioned, there is online HMRC guidance, but there is also a broad package of support from the IOE. As we mentioned, a lot of it is myself, but we do have the full day public courses, which we really have two main ones. So we've got the using CDS, as we call it, which is kind of a focus more on introducing it and comparing it to Chief. And we do also have a more high tier one, if you will, which is advanced CDS, where we'll spend a fair bit of time on error codes, the financial dashboard, that sort of thing. So if that's of interest, you can look those up. We do also have lunchtime learning and webinars like today's, which are usually an hour, give or take, and cover a specific topic, but they might be useful as well. We have the help desk if you're an IOE member. And finally, we have the ITS or consultancy services where you can contact us and then we'll give a bespoke bit of guidance specific to your business on how to get through CDS. And if you submit your own declarations, we can also sit there and help you hopefully submit your first successful declaration. Now, just to mention as well, we've mentioned it a couple of times, but we did a webinar with HMRC a few weeks ago, and you can actually see the recording of that on the Institute of Exports YouTube channel. That covered mostly the steps on what to actually do and how to register, for example, and just some brief points on CDS. So if you've not yet done that stage, do recommend you check out that webinar. Next slide, please. So just to give an overview on the key dates, you might not be aware, but CDS has actually been in effect since the 1st of January 2021. It was brought in to be used in conjunction with the Northern Ireland Protocol, really, because of the dual tariff system. But it was for rest of the world imports into NI and also some GBNI movements. So it's been live a little while. Following that, the next key date obviously is this upcoming one, which is the 30th of September, which is to phase out Chief for imports. And accordingly, from the 1st of October, that's when you need to be using CDS for your import declarations. Technically following that now, you do have the 31st of October, which is your extension deadline, as we've mentioned. But for most people, the next deadline to watch for will be the 31st of March next year, which is where the exports will come in for CDS, or Chief will be phased out for exports. And then 1st of April, you will need to use CDS on those declarations. Next slide, please. So just to give a very brief coverage on what's changing, there's obviously at the more granular level, there's a fair bit. But just to kick off, as we've mentioned, CDS has already been used for GBNI movements and NI trade with the rest of the world, so non-EU markets. So it's not an entirely new system. It's had some time to work out a few kinks, but the deadline coming on the 30th of September is to make the system mandatory for the entire UK now. So there will no longer be two custom systems operating. Some of the headline changes will include the division of multifunction boxes in Chief into single-use, more specific purpose data elements, as they'll be called in CDS. So those that are in the know, box 44 in Chief and box 31 had quite a multi-function purpose. There was a lot of potential data to go into those boxes. You'll probably find in CDS, ones like that have been split out into multiple data elements. So they've moved away from free text as well into more defined codes and statements. Secondly, we are moving away from Chief's old messaging language, which was EDIFACT, which was really old to an extent. It's a messaging standard that predates even Chief. But we're now switching to XML, which will be a far more modern and obviously flexible format. CPC codes, we've got a few questions on this later, so I won't go too in depth, but there's a few changes to be aware of here. Firstly, when you're doing a CPC code in Chief, you would put the full 7-digit code into box 37. In CDS, the actual entry has been split out into 2 data elements. So you've got data element 110 and 111, which we'll come on to later. But a bit beyond that, the CPC codes themselves may have changed. So there's some that will remain the same, but it's not guaranteed. It's highly recommended that you actually go through the CDS guidance and double check if you're even slightly unsure. As a prime example, the old CPC code for permanent exports, a very commonly used one, is actually slightly different now, but so are the ones for customs warehousing, etc. And finally, just a general point, CDS may require more data sets. So there's actually a fair few more data elements than there were boxes in Chief. Again, some of these are just split out from multifunction boxes, but it's something to be aware of, really. And there's going to be a few cases where you actually need to get specific information, or if you're a forwarder or an agent submitting the declarations, you might have a few more instances where you need to check with the trader for some certain information that you might be missing. But next slide, please. Now, we mentioned it, but data elements. So these are going to be split into 8 sort of groups, or data groups as they're literally called. And each one has a kind of theme to it, or a general purpose of those data elements within it. So kicking off, you've got group 1, which is message information. And in here, you'll find the procedure codes. So as you may have picked up on, I mentioned a minute ago, the data elements for the procedure codes are data element 1/10 and 1/11. That means group 1, data element 10 and 11 respectively. So that's how it's formatted. Group 2 is references and documents. So this is the one where you'll usually find additional information to help clear your entry. So you'll reference certificates, licenses, etc. within group 2. Group 3 is parties, so pretty much all of the organizations involved in the customs entry. So here's where you'll find exporter, importer, declarant, but there's a couple new ones in there as well, like seller, buyer, and representative. And that's to enable you to reference occasions where perhaps those parties are different to the actual importer or exporter. So, you might have a different seller to an actual exporter. Group 4 is valuation and taxes, obviously more import skewed, but this is where you're going to find your invoice information, so invoice amount, invoice currency, method of payment, and so on. Group 5 is dates, times, and places, so that would include things like origin, destination, the goods location codes, which have changed from Chief as well, and yeah, the key dates and times for the entry. Group 6 is goods identification, so you'll find in here your package type, quantity of packages, package marks, the container number if applicable, and so on. Group 7 is quite self-explanatory, but transport information. So here's where you'll set your modes of transport, so whether it's sea, air, courier, ro-ro, etc. And you'll also see here the vessel information or flight number, truck information, and so on. And then we've got group 8, statistical information. This one's probably the most conditional based on previous information input, but you'll find in here things like the quota number, if you have any products that have one. But there's a couple other data elements in here, particularly with regards to valuation, that you may find you actually need to do on most entries. So yeah, they all cover the same, or each cover their own sort of purpose. So it does quite help for troubleshooting. If you know you've got an issue with valuation, you can kind of shortlist and think, well, that's going to be somewhere in group 4. So it does help. But next slide, please. And just to highlight some key payment changes here. Some of it's carried over from Chief, but there's just a few key differences to be aware of. So firstly is cash accounts. Now these pretty much replace the old FAS system that you had with Chief. So if you use the old flexible accounting system, that's now been replaced effectively by cash accounts. Now, as soon as you sign up to CDS, you will have gained access to a cash account. You get one by default, and its details are on your CDS financial dashboard. Next, we've got the duty deferment accounts. Again, if you had authorization for one of these in Chief, that will carry over. Don't worry, you don't need to reapply. But what you will need to do is set up a new direct debit. So at the moment, the direct debit's paid to a Chief bank account at HMRC. You'll need to set up a new one to go to HMRC's CDS bank account, but do not cancel the Chief direct debit, particularly for example, this month, because if you use both systems, it needs the different payment information for either. Another feature that they've added is you can actually top up your deferment account in the interim now. So if you blow your deferment, normally you'd have to wait until the 15th day of the following month for your direct debit to restock that deferment account. But with CDS, and again through the CDS financial dashboard, you can actually do a interim top up of your deferment account. So basically chuck some cash into it to cover the customs debt that's come up. Immediate payments, those have carried on. So that's your BACS and CHAPS payments. So you can do those direct from your bank, over the phone, whatever, you can still use those. And then we've got these ones, guarantees. So just to start with the bottom one first, individual guarantee. That's where you might have a guarantee from a financial institution, so bank, building society, to cover potential customs liabilities. Usually that's going to be found in things like customs warehousing or inward processing, where you're suspending payments at the border, but it's basically to say that in the event that it were to become due, you can cover it. The difference between individual and, as you see it named there, a guarantee, you'll probably see the latter also sometimes called general guarantee. But a guarantee account can be an amalgamation of multiple individual accounts. So if you had one individual guarantee for 30,000 and another one for 50,000 pounds, you could consolidate those into a general guarantee account of 80,000 pounds balance total. So a few changes to be aware of there, but overall a fair bit of continuity. Postponed VAT accounting is still an option as well. Next slide, please. So just to cover some very basic steps really, and what you need to do to prepare. Now, the first thing, which I suspect most of us have done by now, is register on the government gateway and get government gateway ID, and then get your URI number. Again, you pretty much have always needed these before you can even import or export anyway. But then to access CDS, you'll need your unique taxpayer reference, you'll need your government gateway ID, and you'll need your EORI number. Again, I suspect most of us are past that step. But crucially, we've got the learn one here. So you kind of need to spend a bit of time understanding what CDS is changed and what it's going to require from you. Again, CPC codes is a prime example. You might now have different CPCs, so you need to check and make sure that you're aware of the new data requirements. Next, we've got payment. So just identify and confirm which methods of payment you're going to use for duty and VAT. Understand the different methods. And as we've mentioned, if you're using a deferment account, make sure you set up the direct debit to the CDS account now. And the final one there, and really quite important, if you are a trader and you use an agent, you do actually need to authorize that agent to access your different methods of payment in your CDS dashboard. If you've not done it already, and they go on the 1st of October to submit an entry on, say, your deferment account, they won't be allowed to do so. So you need to make sure you've gone into that dashboard and done that. Equally, for the agents and forwarders, those submitting the entry, if you've got a roster of clients, you need to be making sure that those clients have authorized you. So again, a bit of a two-way street on that one, but just be aware that's something to make sure you've done before 1st of October. And finally, if you're submitting your own declarations, try and use the dress rehearsal service. It's a test environment for CDS, but it more or less mirrors the actual live environment. So if you can get something successfully through on the dress rehearsal, the chances are it will also be successful on the live environment. So again, if you're doing your own entries, you're probably doing it through an intermediary software. So just make sure you have actually authorized that software as well. It's another authorization you need to do. If you need help with that step, you can usually contact the account manager of your software provider and they can help you with that. But the final step is to try and submit live entries. So once you've gone through all of that, worth pointing out, some software providers won't actually allow you access to the live CDS environment until you have successfully done a dress rehearsal submission. That might be the case some of you have seen, but yeah, try and get your first live ones through. And that does bring us very nicely onto our next slide, for which I will hand over to Will again.
Thanks, Matt. And yeah, it does bring us on nicely into the next poll, which is just going to ask you if you have already started using CDS to submit declarations, and hopefully the answer options are relatively self-explanatory there. But yeah, as you are starting to answer that poll, we are now in the questions part of the webinar. It's an extended Q&A today. That's the main point of today's webinar, though I hope you found that recap presentation helpful. If you do need more information about the migration or would like more step-by-step guidance, I've posted the YouTube link to the recording of the last webinar we did on this in the chat, and I've also posted in there the government guidance about how to request an extension to using Chief if that's something you require to do. As noted by Matt earlier, that's very much for if there's, I think, technical issues around starting to use CDS rather than because you don't want to. I think Matt was quite strong to say that you need to make that move either way. So we're going to get into the plant questions now. I'm going to group these as much as possible. Just a reminder, everyone, please ask your questions in as concise a way as possible. It makes it a lot easier for me to read them. The first group of questions I'm going to do is around agents or intermediaries, as a lot of you use intermediaries, as shown by the earlier poll. First question is from Philip, though, and he asks, will I need to access CDS if our business only uses agents to complete our export-import clearances? And similar to this, Harry asked, do you also need CDS software if your customs clearance is done by a broker or intermediary?
Yep, so straightforward answer to those is, as a general rule, yes, you will still need to register. There's a couple of reasons for it. If you're using postponed VAT accounting particularly, the C79 and the VAT statements will now be on your CDS financial dashboard. So of course you need to sign up to access that. The other reason, again, if you have certain methods of payment like a deferment account or you want your agent to use your cash account, then you will actually need to grant them authorization and access to those accounts again through the CDS dashboard. So in pretty much every case, if you're involved in importing or exporting, just sign up to CDS and make sure you go through those authorization steps because it will just prevent any potential holdups come 1st of October.
Thanks, Matt. And presumably just with that, it's worth just reminding people that the importance of having that clear dialogue with your intermediaries throughout this process is presumably quite important, just making sure everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. There's a lot of cases where some agents are already putting entries through CDS. They phased out Chief perhaps a couple of weeks ago. But yeah, in all cases, this is the kind of thing that your agent would be letting you know is like, by the way, we need you to do this before October. Otherwise, this import you've got coming in a couple of weeks, we won't be able to clear it, and so on. So yeah, it's never just on you as a trader. If you've got an agent, there should be a two-way dialogue. They should always be on hand to give you a bit of advice if there's anything you're struggling with as well.
Great, thanks, Matt. And thanks for the questions, Philip and Harry. Here's one from Andrew, who asks, if we are importing goods from a supplier shipping on DDP terms, does the supplier also need to register for CDS? So similar to the first couple of questions, but an Inca term thrown in there just for good measure.
Again, quick answer is yes, they would still need to. Of course, with DDP as delivered duty paid. In that scenario, the supplier is also the importer. And as the importer of record, they have the responsibility for all of the import formalities like customs declarations and payment of duty and VAT at the border, etc. So accordingly, they will also need to make sure they're registered for CDS. So any agents they're using here in the UK, for instance, are able to actually get their entries through. So yeah, as we've said, very similar to a general principle, but just being DDP, the fact that it's an overseas company does not exempt it from needing to register. The only thing they'll need to do, they'll have the same requirements really. In order to sign up, they'll need their government gateway ID, a URI number, and a unique taxpayer reference. So without getting into too much detail, that'll mean they also need to be a non-established taxable person. So again, they may or may not be VAT registered, but as long as that company pays import tax in the UK, effectively, then they are the importer of record and need to sign up. So yeah, sort of more complicated scenario, but yeah, general rule applies.
Great, thanks, Matt, and thanks, Andrew, for the question. I'm just going to share the results of the poll now. So thank you again, everyone, for answering. 40% of you have already started using CDS, 46% of you haven't, 14% not sure. And just by way of comparison, when we last asked this question in August, over 2/3 of you hadn't started using CDS and only a fifth of you had. So really interesting to see that there's a double the amount of people saying yes in this month, September, obviously 10 days before the deadline hits. So Matt, an encouraging trend there.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, for those that are not aware, just because the deadline for implementation is 1st of October, doesn't mean that you can already have been using CDS. As I mentioned, a few agents, freight forwarders in particular, have been using CDS a little while now. And I think it's quite a prudent move for a lot of people to do it before the deadline came in, just so they can get used to it beforehand. But yeah, definitely a positive trend to see that we're now flipping obviously more in favor or closer in favor to those that are now doing majority on CDS.
Great, thanks, Matt, and thank you everyone for responding. And just if we go into the next slide, I would just confirm that we are very much indeed doing questions. One in from Christine, which is, how do we view import clearance documents on CDS to ensure the correct declaration has been made by the freight forwarder?
Again, the answer to this one is you can't really view it through CDS. Annoyingly as well, we'll probably have a few questions on it in a bit, but the C88 and the E2 documents, which you're probably used to with Chief, they also effectively no longer exist with CDS. The usual documents you would use to double check that agents are doing things correctly is kind of out the window. The justification for it was that it's a digital system, CDS, and it's moving away from paper. As a fallback, you will have to either request a summary document from your forwarder, because certain custom software providers are producing their own summary document now. It's basically a proprietary one to fill the function of a C88, but without any sort of standardized HMRC form. If they can't produce a document like that, they should be able to run reports or summaries of all the entries you've done for you, either in a kind of Excel format or very similar, where it will give a fair deep dive on what they've done. So yeah, there's no standard document to do it now, unfortunately, but there will be ways around it. The other one is MSS reports. If not using those, you can get them from HMRC. There will basically be a report down to, if you select it, commodity code level, and that will give you a breakdown of all of the entries done within a certain period by that forwarder. So yeah, no perfect easy way of doing it, but there's a few mechanisms you can do to get around it. One advantage of the CDS dashboard is that it does actually have a transaction history. So if your agent or your forwarder is using one of your methods of payment, you'll actually be able to see up to about 12 months statement history there. So if you've given them access to your deferment account, you'll be able to see exactly how much funds were taken out per entry, because it'll give the MRN as well. So that's another way. If something looks wildly wrong, you'll be able to see it in that dashboard as well. But yeah, unfortunately, C88s go in the way of the dodo, so it's a bit difficult to find a standard way of auditing, really.
No, thanks, Matt. And we were getting a couple of questions on about if the C88 was going to be replaced. So that's, I think that's covered that little group of questions as well. So that's all good. Honky dory, as they say. We had a question in from Kath, which is just about setting up on the CDS. And she asked, how can we be sure that it is being set up correctly and completely? Presumably the trader dress rehearsal will help with this, but yeah, over to you, Matt.
Yeah, precisely. It depends on what method they're doing of doing entries. If they're doing their own entry submissions, you'll first see a bit of a red flag if you don't get dress rehearsal authorization, or if you do, then you can't actually successfully submit an entry. That will be the first sign that something's gone wrong. The other thing should be, really, as long as you can log into your CDS financial dashboard, that should mean you're good to go. Once you apply for access to that dashboard, it usually takes a couple hours. In some cases recently, it's taken a few days. But overall, if you can log into that website, that platform, that should mean you're good to go. But yeah, as we say, the telltale will be if you or an agent tries to submit an entry and it says rejections, it will probably reference something along the line of your URI number. It will say it's not valid or there's an issue there, which obviously if you then go and check if the URI number is valid elsewhere and it still says that issue, it could be a problem with CDS registration. So in that scenario, you would unfortunately have to probably try and contact HMRC and try your luck there if there's a problem. And again, there are a few known issues, which is, I think, why this potential extension came in.
Thanks, Matt. We've had a few questions just come in on licenses. And again, there's one of these follows on from C88. So Rachel asks, how will CDS affect shipping of controlled items on the consolidated list? And Joe asks, or says, we ship controlled goods for which we have to hold a C88 as evidence of export under the terms of our licenses. What will we need to use instead?
So a couple of things there. The way you declare export controlled goods will be very similar. You'll still need to reference the license on the customs entry. So if you've got any OGEL or open general export license, for instance, or really anything you've applied through from Spire, you'll you'll need to reference it on the customs entry. So you'll probably need to put something into most likely data element 2/2, which is additional information, 2/3, which is additional documentation, and potentially data element 3/39, which is holders of authorization. So if you have to have an authorization for something, you'll need to do it in 339 as well. So as an example, something like firearms, there's a document code for data element 2.3. You would need to do 9100 for a firearms license, which is either CL, single issue license, or your OGL license. So again, the principle of how you declare something is very much similar to how it was in Chief. It's just where you input it with CDS that has changed. Now, regarding the C88 part of that question, I believe the actual guidance is that you need to have evidence of export. Now, yes, conventionally the evidence of export was C88, but a couple of things there. Obviously, we've got a few more months in which you can continue to use Chief for your export declaration, so you can keep doing it. But once the CDS implementation does come in, you just need something that will hold proof of export. And again, in theory, that could be something like an MSS report, a proprietary document from the software provider of the agent, or if you're submitting your own declarations, you can ask for that. So Multi-Freight is one of the software providers. They've got their own. I believe CargoWise and a couple of others are beginning to implement their own as well. So I think given a couple months, you'll probably see most of these providers have an equivalent C88 form that you'll be able to hold as your evidence of export to meet the requirements of export controls. So I don't think I'll have too many issues there, but yeah, the main problem you may run into is finding what to put in the specific data elements, but that's very much the case of anything in CDS for anybody new to it, to be honest.
No, thanks, Matt. That's a lot to get through. I'm sure we'll probably do it. We've not done a controls webinar for a while, so it might be something we can bring up then, as well as we kind of learn more about how it's all going to work. I'll come back to just one more question on agents, intermediaries. So Arnaldo has asked, how many freight forwarders can you authorize in CDS? And Colleen asks, can direct representation authorization from traders be given to brokers via CDS, or will it still be via written authorization? So a number of quantity and method there in terms of authorization.
Yeah, so on quantity, there's not really a limit. You can authorize and add as many agents as you want effectively. Obviously, if you've only got the one agent, it's very easy, but yeah, you've got a lot. So if you use forwarders and you potentially use a fast parcel operator like FedEx, DHL, etc., you can authorize as many of those as you need to do. Regarding the sort of second part of the question on direct representation, etc., that is separate. That's no longer, or sorry, it's not on the CDS dashboard. It's still very much going to be a separate form you probably have to sign between you and the agent. The reason being it follows a separate legal code. So without getting too in depth, but a direct representation is covered under the UK Cross-Border Trade Act 2018. And any direct representation you sign should reference that legislation, because it's what governs and sets out the standard of those representation criteria. So yeah, you should still have a separate form. To be honest, if you've signed a form between yourself and an agent in the last approximately 18 months, it should still be valid. Again, just look for one that references the UK Taxation Cross-Border Trade Act 2018. As long as it mentions that, it's still up to date, effectively. But yeah, it won't replace, nothing on the CDS dashboard will replace that form in its function. The authorization in the CDS dashboard is purely to allow an agent authorization to use your different payment methods.
Thanks, Matt. So we're going to take, I'll do one more question before we do a quick poll. Just a big thanks, everyone. Loads of questions coming through. As noted, this is a 45-minute webinar, so we won't be able to go through everything today, but we're trying to group things where we can, so hopefully we'll get through topics at the very least. You mentioned MSS data briefly before, so it seems so it's going to still be a thing with CDS. Maria asks, how will the migration affect MSS data? And she also asks, is there a direct correlation tool to help with new CPC codes? A nice segue into CPCs as well.
The migration, if you've already paid for MSS reports for Chief, you'll basically get a CDS equivalent or a CDS one as well if you used it in the same period. So if in September this month you did some entries on Chief and some on CDS, and you get an MSS report for the period, you'll get two different ones to cover the two different systems, but you won't be charged for the extra one, if that makes sense. When it comes to correlating, it's worth pointing out the MSS report will summarize the entry itself. It won't extrapolate the equivalent CDS from chief elements, if you know what I mean. So if you've done a CDS entry, whatever CDS CPC code you put in that entry will appear on the MSS. It won't correlate to a chief one for you. You would need to know what the chief equivalent was. And ideally, obviously, if you've got yourself or a forwarder doing CDS entries, you would have already done that validation step. You'll already know what your CPC codes are, because it's the kind of thing you should check before you start doing the entries, because of that risk that they've changed and the process might be different. So MSS, pretty much the same. Again, its purpose is the exact same. The reports just might look ever so slightly different to reflect CDS data instead. But yeah, it won't correlate anything for you.
So just to double back on that, because we've had a few people ask about CPC codes. So they are going to be different in CDS. Is there any kind of correlation table being produced by government, or is it, people just have to kind of figure that out? What should people be doing?
There's not a table really, unfortunately. The CDS guidance in general it sometimes does give you the chief equivalent. So for example, when you're looking through the data elements, it will tell you what the chief box was, but that's kind of as far as it goes. When it gets to CPC codes, there's some that you might expect remain the same, and they probably will have. So if you're using free circulation CPC code 4000000, I can tell you that it's the exact same code in CDS, but that's not a given by any means. I mentioned the export one earlier, so a permanent export CPC, that has changed. And there'll be a few differences for things like temporary admission and any other special ones like that. So again, you'll have to know that there's a few fundamental changes to CPCs which will determine why they're different. So again, I can't go too in depth, but they're split into two boxes. As I mentioned, the first box will be 4 digits of your 7-digit CPC code. And those 4 digits will usually determine what process you're going into. So it's split out so that you've got requested procedure and then previous procedure. So for example, to do a free circulation entry from a customs warehouse, your code will start with 40, free circulation, 71, which is it was in customs warehousing. So again, that might be something you need to look into in a bit more granular level, just to make sure that what you've now got is correct. That there is a correlation matrix in CDS, but that's purely for making sure that the 4-digit code in data element 110 is compatible with the final 3-digit code in data element 111. So it's a bit of a large topic, the CPCs. You'll need to make sure that you found the guidance. Again, I've given you the data element, so you should be able to look that up in CDS's guidance and just see which ones you've got, if they still apply. Again, you can't really assume that they do, because the formatting has changed itself. It's not just that the numbers has changed arbitrarily. There is a reason behind it.
Thanks, Matt. That's yeah, it seems like you could go down a minefield all of that, a lot of details. So probably
Yeah,
best to hold back a little bit, because we do have for training and consultancy people
yeah.
can go through. Just on the next slide, we're going to do one more poll. Just asking you, how prepared would you feel if you had to start using CDS today? And the options there, again, hopefully quite self-explanatory. Very prepared, scaling down to not at all prepared, with a not sure thrown in as well. We had just one clarification question on representation. So this is from Jenny, who says, to confirm, we will be required to add and authorize every individual customs agent or their IOE that our one forwarder may use. We cannot simply authorize one forwarder through direct representation or direct representative letter. So how does that work with one forwarder but lots of agents?
Bit more complicated territory, a little bit outside of CDS, to be fair. But the way CDS is now broken out, you can declare a representative. So if you're a trader and you've appointed an agent with a signed form, they're your representative effectively. But if they themselves have to subcontract to another agent, that agent becomes the declarant. Now, under direct representation, there's kind of a chain of responsibility there, where the representative you've appointed will have to make sure that that declarant agent is compliant, legally and in terms of data entry, etc. So in theory, you could actually just do the one direct representation form to your appointed forwarder if that was the case. If the declarant needs to use your deferment account or your cash account, you will need to go into the CDS dashboard and authorize them. So an authorization you give in the CDS dashboard for one party will not carry over if that party then subcontracts to others, if that makes sense. But again, just to separate, so that's the payment authorization side, but direct representation itself is a separate legal framework where technically it is still direct representation if the one you've appointed subcontracts. It's just with CDS, obviously in the dashboard, again, it's the payment methods you will have to do if one of your agents uses another one. So again, hope that broadly made sense. It's quite a complicated area, but general rule of thumb, just assume that if someone's using your method of payment, you need to authorize that specific party.
Thanks, Matt. That sounded pretty comprehensive to me. So if I just share the results of the poll, conscious of time, but this is the first time we've had over 50% of you saying you're either quite or very prepared. So 60% of you are either very or quite prepared, and just about 34% of you aren't prepared yet, remainder not sure. So again, there's a shift there going on, people feeling more prepared now, as you'd hope, right, at this stage. But thank you everyone for answering that poll. On the next slide, we'll see we're still on questions. So I'm going to ask a few here just about payments in particular. So Alan asks, can you use a deferment account to account for import duty and also use PVA for VAT in one declaration?
Yes, you can. Deferment accounts, actually, to be completely honest with you, are a bit of a nuisance to enter into CDS, whereas in Chief you would put the deferment account number and put deferment as method of payment. In CDS, there's a couple more boxes or data elements, sorry, that you actually have to do. But general rule of thumb, yes, you can. You'll get a header level method of payment item level method of payment box where you declare your deferment. Do not use payment method G in CDS for postponed VAT. What you should do instead is do a data element called fiscal reference. And in that box, you will put code, which is FR1, and put the VAT number. If you put method of payment G for PVA, it will cause a problem because it's not actually supposed to be used. Basically, if you do the fiscal ref, the system assumes you're using PVA. So again, in the method of payment data element, put deferment, but just do additional fiscal reference in its appropriate data element, and that's how you get to use both payment methods. So again, bit of a change from Chief, arguably less straightforward than it was. But yeah, just so you're aware.
Interesting. Don't use method G. That's it seems a good thing to remember. Gotcha, if that's said correctly. Sorry if not. Do we need to register to a new deferment account, or can we use the existing one with CDS?
You can use your existing one. It will carry over. The only thing you'll need to do is set up the new direct debit to the CDS account. And there's a link to do that on your CDS dashboard. It should appear there on the very front screen of it.
I'll go through these quickly. Michael asks, will our existing credit limit remain the same?
If you mean a credit limit with a forwarder, that's not to do with CDS, that's separate. If you mean deferment account limit, that will remain the same. So if you've got a 10 grand deferment account, it will stay 10 grand. If you've got a certain guarantee account limit, again, that will stay the same. So credit limit is more between a commercial arrangement between you and any agent that you use by that name. Again, if you're referring to deferment or guarantee, they'll stay the same.
Joe asks, is there now a requirement to have a customs comprehensive guarantee in place?
No, but if you have a deferment account, you either have one or you've waived one, and in which case you need to declare either or. So if you don't have one, you have to declare a code to mention that it's been waived. If you do have one with your deferment account, then you need to mention the guarantee details in a CDS entry. But no, if you're not using a deferment account, if you're just using cash account or just PVA, etc., then you won't need a CCG.
Cool. We haven't touched on special procedures yet, so I'll just do a couple on those. Sylvia asks, could you clarify how simplified fronted declaration should be raised on CDS?
You need to use a different declaration category now. That's something we haven't really mentioned. Again, refer to one of our courses if you need a breakdown there. But you need declaration category if it's for an import, I1, and whether you're using SDP or EIDR will slightly affect which I1 you need to do. But it's probably I1 C and F for SDP. So that's your declaration category. And then you select your CPC codes accordingly. So the CPC code will depend what you're doing the simplified procedure into. If it's just a general recirculation, it will still be 4000. But if you're doing customs warehousing or something, it will be different. So yeah, again, that's a bit more of a complex one. To get the full breakdown, I do recommend one of the courses because we do cover that.
Interesting. In that case, I imagine your answer to that. I was going to do a couple of quick fire questions on
Sure.
how to impact IPR, how to impact temporary imports, but presumably the answers are relatively similar, just with a couple of data changes.
Yeah. Yeah, the thing that governs those is firstly always going to be the declaration category. Now it's a kind of new data element that you need to do that Chief didn't have, and accordingly, any declaration category you do, the CPC code needs to be compatible with it. So there's certain declaration categories, like for example, H2 is the import declaration category for customs warehousing, and then only customs warehousing CPCs will work with it. So yeah, you would have to go onto it's called CDS Trade Tariff Volume 3. That's the government site for all the guidance. You'd have to have a bit of a navigation through there again, or get in touch with us for a more specific query.
Thanks, Matt. I'm conscious that this webinar was billed as 45 minutes. It seems to have gone extremely quickly. So thank you everyone for so many great questions. We'll just do a couple of quick fire questions just so we've covered a couple of topics we've not come on
Yep.
to as of yet. So we haven't covered Northern Ireland yet. So you mentioned earlier CDS was introduced as part of the protocol for Northern Ireland. Does trade for Northern Irish companies, I guess particularly around GBNI or NI Rest of World trade or NI EU trade, change as a result of CDS at all?
Across the board, not really. Again, for the most of the people dealing with it, they've probably already been using CDS. If you've been using the Trader Support Service or TSS, that's basically interfacing with CDS already as well. So it might be a case where you've been doing Northern Ireland entries in the last 18 months-ish, where you might not realize it, but it's probably been going through CDS, unless it was between Northern Ireland and EU, but separate. So yeah, shouldn't be a major change here. But again, if you've got a Northern Ireland URI number, so XI, you may need to do a separate registration. And equally, if you've already applied your XI one, you may need to do a separate registration for your GB URI number if you're established in both territories. So be aware that can cause some issues. So you might need to get in touch with HMRC on that one.
Thanks, Matt. Just on the trader address rehearsal, do you need to be using a CDS software provider to use this TDR? And will TDR be available beyond the deadline?
Yes to both. In order to interface with TDR, you need a software that works with it, which will be one of the commercial software providers like Multifreight, Daycar, etc. TDR will stay live, sort of like Chief's training system. That's stayed live with it almost right through to the end. Yeah, the dress rehearsal will continue to be around as a test environment for you to practice with CDS and try a few things. Like I mentioned, it's almost a mirror of the live system. It's the TDR is updated once a month, whereas the live system is updated constantly. So what the TDR will do is consolidate all the updates the live systems had in a given period and then apply all of those updates at once to the test system. But yeah, it should always be available for you.
And one last question, because we did get a few questions earlier on about the extension form, and I've sort of not touched on them too much because, as you said, Matt, earlier, it's only for people having technical issues, isn't it, with the migration? But one question which I thought was interesting comes from Faye, who asked, where is it gone? Is it just the agent that needs to apply for the extension, or would it need to be the business as well? And when they do apply, do they need to provide the IOE number for all the suppliers they will be using Chief Clear for on the extension period?
On the guidance as written, I would say it needs to be the trader or the party struggling to make the switch. So if you're an agent and you're acting on behalf of a trader who, for whatever reason, cannot get set up on CDS, it's the trader that will need to apply for the extension. And then you as the agent may still be able to use Chief, bit of a grey area there. But I believe it will check against the importer's URI if there's an authorization effectively. Yeah, but it's one of those that if you're the forwarder yourself or the customs agent and you are struggling, then yes, you would need to apply for the authorization and again try and get that resolved within the sort of month you have. Obviously, difficult situation for you then because you'll have to let all your clients know that in the interim you're going to have to keep doing Chief entries. But yeah, it's one of those, again, it's case by case basis. So if you do have a problem, it's one of those where you may as well try your hand at going through the application and getting HMRC's word on it, because again, if they deem it as a issue of just internal process or understanding, they'll reject it. They say you should be ready. Yeah, but if you've got a genuine technical problem preventing the registration, then it's the party that's having the problem that needs to apply.
Thanks, Matt. And yeah, again, thank you everyone for the questions. There's been absolutely loads which have come through, not just in this webinar, but in the two webinars we ran earlier this year and for our technical helpline and all sorts of places we've been getting questions. So I hope we've been able to answer a decent spread in the time we've had today. But yeah, once again, thank you to Matt for being so knowledgeable about CDS, but also for being so able to answer pretty much all of your questions, I think, there. So I hope everyone's found that useful, and thank you again to Matt. Um, on the last slide, you will see again some of the support that the Institute is providing to traders preparing to use CDS. This includes 2 training courses, consultancy services, our CDS FAQs, our technical helpline, and our lunchtime learning webinars for members. Export.org.uk is where you can find out more information about that support package, and the URLs on the slide there as well. I've posted the link to the previous CDS webinar we did, and a recording of today's webinar will be posted tomorrow morning. We will be sending that recording to all registrants. If for any reason that doesn't come through to your main inbox, please do let us know. As you leave, please do let us know what you thought of today's webinar and any suggestion for topics on future webinars by completing the exit survey. And for those exporters on the line, please rest assured we'll be covering the exports deadline for CDS, I'm sure, in the coming months, probably early 2023. But for now, thank you for joining us today, and I hope you have a great rest of the day. So bye everyone, and see you later. Bye.
Bye everyone, thank you.